about things that are taking place now. Please join me in welcoming Mark Bixler.
Thank you for that introduction. It's exciting for me to be here. I think this is wonderful that you're having a seminar to call attention to the problem of genocide, a problem that not just has happened in the past, but is still happening today. My plan is to talk here for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes if I get carried away. And then I hope we can turn this into more of a conversation and less of a monologue. I'd be interested to hear your comments and try to answer whatever questions you might have. Before I begin, I'd like to see a show of hands, and let's be honest. How many of you think that right now you could find the country of Sudan on a map? Okay, that's good. How many have heard the word Darfur? Okay, that's great. You're ahead of where I was a few years ago. When I started this process, I really knew very little about Sudan and very little about Sudanese refugees, but I've learned quite a bit. As you heard in the introduction, I have been a journalist since 1992. I've recently become an editor, but for 14 years I was a newspaper reporter, first in North Carolina and since 1997 here in Atlanta. I'm sure that you know intuitively what my life is like as a journalist. You know that from time to time I interview people, carry on a notebook, and write down what they say. You probably also know that from time to time people call the newspaper to try and interest a reporter in writing a particular story. And I want to tell you about one of the calls like that I received, a call that set me on a particular journey. In the spring of 2001, the telephone rang on my desk on the 6th floor newsroom of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in downtown Atlanta. On the other end of the line was a woman who volunteers in Atlanta with refugees. Now, as you probably know, refugees are people who have been forced from their native countries and can't return for fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, their membership in a social group or an ethnic group, or their political opinion. So, for example, a democracy advocate from Iran could be considered a refugee because he might be tortured or imprisoned if he was detained by the authorities in Iran. People who are persecuted for belonging to a certain tribe often are refugees. In Afghanistan, many, many people were refugees from the rule of the Taliban. If they were to stay in Afghanistan, they would have faced persecution, jail terms, torture, and so forth. Well, this lady who called me works with refugees here in Atlanta, and she wanted me to write an article about a very unusual group of refugees known as the Lost Boys of Sudan. I'd never heard of the Lost Boys of Sudan. I couldn't even find Sudan on a map in 2001. Didn't know much about it. But what she said was really fascinating to me. She told me this group of young men was coming to the United States, including to Atlanta. She said they were unusual for really two reasons. One is that they were coming as young men without mothers or fathers. She said they'd been forced away from their parents during the chaos of a war that very rarely makes the headlines here in the United States. She said they were unusual for another reason, that is that they were coming to the Atlanta area with no knowledge of the modern world. They'd never seen tall buildings or flicked on electric lights. They'd never used flush toilets or held ice or written a check or ridden a train. Many of them had never even climbed stairs They come from one of the most isolated parts of the globe. Yet, like other refugees, they had essentially 4 months of limited assistance from the government before they had to find a job and support themselves. Now, she thought that if I wrote an article about them in the paper, people might read that article and volunteer to help them. Well, I was intrigued. So I went out with her about a week after she called to the little town of Clarkston, which is not too far from where we are right now in DeKalb County, about 11 miles northeast of downtown Atlanta. I went out on a Tuesday afternoon with her, and a photographer from the newspaper came out with me, and we interviewed a young man. And he told a very dramatic story of having to leave his home as a young child and having to walk hundreds of miles across some of the most inhospitable landscape on earth. He told about how many of his friends were killed as children walking without parents. And how survivors on this journey, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a few minutes, had to drink their own urine and eat mud just to survive. And how very many of them, in fact, did not survive. This was a very emotional thing for him to talk about, as you can imagine. I went back to the newspaper that Tuesday afternoon and wrote a story that ran on the front page of the next day's paper. And after that story ran, something very unusual happened. I heard from more than 100 people who read the story and wanted to volunteer their time or their money. That's unusual. I personally think every story I write is so well written that 100 people should email me and tell me how good it is, but that's just not the reality. So there was something about this story that resonated with people. And I wasn't quite sure what it was. I think I know now, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But I knew that there was great interest, and so my editors and I decided to tell a more complete story. Instead of just going out one Tuesday afternoon, interviewing a young man and writing up what he said to go in the next day's newspaper, we decided to tell a more complete story. We decided that I should follow a group of 4 of these lost boys for their first 4 months in the United States. The idea being that the government gives them about 4 months of limited assistance, and then they've got to be on their own. So I went to the airport in Atlanta on July 18th, 2001, and I met 4 young men on the day they stepped off the airplane into this modern world. I tell in the book that I've written, The Lost Boys of Sudan. It follows them for their first few years in the United States. I parachuted into their lives. They were very kind and patient, and they let me come into their lives and ask question after question after question. I was with them as they went to their apartment in Clarkston for the very first time. These are people who'd never seen tall buildings. They'd never seen apartments. They'd been living on 1 meal a day of mushed up grain for the last 9, 10, 11, or 12 years. So everything was new. A caseworker with a local refugee resettlement agency explained to them the light switch and the hot water and the cold water and the Venetian blinds and the electrical outlets and so forth. We walked into the kitchen, which had been stocked by one of these agencies. And one of the guys picked up a mysterious container of orange powder. He said, "It is written here, Tang, but we do not know if it is healthy." So everything was new. Tang was new. Frozen beef was new. Milk was new. A gas stove that magically heated black coils without fire was new. I hung out with them, went with them to get their Social Security cards. I went with them to get their job interview at Lenox Mall and other places. I was in their apartment as they watched divorce court on a donated black and white TV. And I document in the book their adjustment to life in the United States. I also document the history that produced these young men. And that's what I want to talk about today, because we need to understand the history of this country so we can understand what's happening right now in Sudan. You've heard a lot about genocide, and I imagine you've talked about genocide in Armenia in 1915 and in Europe in the Second World War. Maybe you've talked about the people in Cambodia who were slaughtered in the 1970s, or people in Bosnia who were killed in the 1990s. Maybe you've heard about the 800,000 people who were slaughtered in Rwanda in 1994. You've wondered, how the heck could that happen? Well, it's happening right now. And to understand a little bit about what is happening and why it's happening, I think we need to understand something about the history of the country where it's happening. Sudan, as you may know, is the largest country in Africa. It's in the northern part of Africa, just to the south of Egypt, to the west of Ethiopia. It is home to many, many people who speak many, many languages and worship many, many different gods. When you think of Sudan, it's important to think really of two broad regions, north and south. The country is actually much more complex than that, and the book gets into those complexities, but for today I want us to think of north and south. They're part of the same country, but they're very, very different. People who live in northern Sudan are Arab Muslims. People who live in the south are very different. They're not Arab, they're black, and they're not Muslim by and large. They're a mixture of Christians and people who follow traditional animist religions that deify natural objects like rocks or trees, so forth. There's a big swamp between north and south. So these two people historically have had very little to do with each other. In fact, it wasn't until the 1800s that there is any mention in recorded history of contact between the two peoples. In the 1820s, the Ottoman Empire held sway in what's now Egypt. And the fellow who was in charge there wanted a big military. He had a lot of plans, and he needed soldiers for his army. So he decided to send slave raiding parties through this big swamp into southern Sudan to get soldiers. His slave raiding parties became the first people known to have penetrated this swamp. And they went from village to village to village on a campaign of killing, kidnap, and rape. They took people who lived in southern Sudan, men primarily, and forced them to serve in this new army. As you can imagine, this was a very traumatic experience for the people who lived in southern Sudan. The biggest tribe there is called the Dinka. This is their first experience with the outside world, and it's not very pleasant. Imagine suddenly people coming into your home and killing and raping. That obviously would be a traumatic thing. It's such a traumatic period of the Dinka history that they call this part of their history the spoiling of the world, or the time when the world was spoiled. Now, it's important that we keep all this in mind as we lead up to what's happening in Darfur, because from the perspective of the Southerners in Sudan, this caused them to have a very deep suspicion of outsiders, and of the northern Sudanese in particular. Now, we should also mention that northern Sudanese, who are Arab Muslims, as opposed to the black African Christian and animist in the south, had a very dim view of Southerners. They looked down on Southerners. They referred to them with the Arabic word abid, which means literally translated slave. They viewed them almost as subhuman, which I think was probably a recurring theme in some of your discussions of other genocides. I know that in 1994, a lot of the killers referred to the victims as cockroaches. It's a way to dehumanize someone. So it's very easy to kill someone who's a cockroach, but perhaps not so easy to kill someone who is a mother of 2 children who has dreams of being an accountant or is fully human, what have you. So people in northern Sudan referred to Southerners by the word abid, which means slave, although in practical usage it has much more, maybe the direct equivalent would be the racial slur that we all know for African Americans that has been in use here for some time in the USA. So, in the 1800s, you had the first experience of slave raids. It was very unpleasant for the Southerners. And this began a history of people in northern Sudan looking down on and repressing and subjugating people in southern Sudan. From 1899 until 1955, the British ruled Sudan. You all know, I'm sure, that many European powers set up colonies in Africa, and they grouped together people who had nothing to do with each other, who weren't particularly, didn't particularly consider themselves members of the same nation, but they grouped them together anyway. This happened in Sudan. Now, let's just think about this. If you go from Atlanta to Seattle, or from Atlanta to New York City, you will find differences, right, in the way people talk, in their accent, maybe in the foods that they like. Down here, what do you have? You have a Coke. Coke is a soda. It could be Coke, could be Pepsi. We call it a Coke. Maybe they call it pop somewhere else. So there are differences in language or in usage, differences in racial composition of the population, differences in food. Maybe they don't fry stuff as much in other parts of the country as we do in the South. But fundamentally, people have a sense of themselves as American, whether you're in Texas or Seattle or Vermont or Dunwoody. We have a sense of national unity, you might call it, despite these differences. Well, that's not the case in a lot of parts of the world, and it's certainly not the case in parts of Africa. It's not the case in Sudan, where people did not choose to be grouped together in a nation, but were grouped together in a nation by Europeans. Okay, so in 1899 to 1955, the British ruled Sudan, and they ruled it really as 2 separate entities, North and South. They recognized the differences. They recognized that these people didn't really see that they had much in common with each other, so they kept them apart. They didn't allow travel or trade between the 2 regions. As a result of that, people in northern Sudan followed along this path of having trade and contact with people in the Muslim cultures of North Africa and the Middle East, while the South remained largely, as one scholar told me in an interview, a museum of nature. People in northern Sudan received a formal education, much as you're receiving, in reading and writing and arithmetic and science. People in South, very few received this kind of education. They were educated in how to cultivate cattle, how to raise crops, how to fish, how to build a grass hut, so on and so forth. So they were educated, but not in the formal way that we think of. And that's important because in 1956, Sudan became independent. The whole country, North and South, now became an independent, sovereign nation. The people who were more educated were in the North. They also had this history of looking down on people in the South and regarding them as subhuman. So they controlled all the levers of power in forming the new government. For example, there were 800 positions to be filled in the colonial government, 800 jobs. 792 of those jobs went to people from the North, and only 8 went to people from the South, which is a very telling statistic. It shows, obviously, that people in the North dominated the process, controlled the process. So people in the South felt left out because they were left out. This began a civil war that would rage for all but 11 of the next 50 years. I interviewed former President Carter a few times for this book, and he calls the war in Sudan perhaps the worst man-made disaster in the second half of the 20th century. There was a brief period of peace in Sudan from 1972 to 1983. But about this time, the Muslims who ruled Sudan began to drift more toward a very conservative, fundamentalist, militant style of Islam, similar to what had happened in Iran in 1979 when there was a takeover of our embassy by Muslims who embraced this kind of militant form or extreme form of Islam, while the majority of Muslims, of course, do not. Same thing happened in Sudan. The leader is a Muslim, and for much of the 70s, he would dress, for example, like, in safari-type clothing and so forth. But he began to wear the flowing white robe and so forth, responding to the political pressures that were exerted by the popularity of conservative Islam. This is important because he reneged essentially on the peace deal, broke some promises. He imposed Islamic law on the entire nation, even the non-Muslim parts, and this caused a resumption of the civil war in 1983. Since 1983, more than 2 million people have been killed in this war. Now here's an important point. Most of them have been civilians. More than 2 million people, mainly civilians who died of war-induced famine or disease. Let's think about that number, 2 million. That's a big number. That's equivalent, just in the number of people killed, to one attack on the scale of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack. Every week for 13 years. If you imagine your reaction to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, if you're like me, you probably felt a range of emotions from grief, disgust, fear, anger, so forth. Imagine feeling that once a week for 13 years. And you see that the kind of terror that we experienced on one day in 2001 really is a very regular occurrence, has been a regular occurrence in Sudan. The war in Sudan has forced more than 5 million people from their homes. That's more than in any other nation on earth. 5 million people have been forced from their home in Sudan. So it's not been unusual for aid workers and journalists to see large groups of people walking through the wilderness in Sudan, some going toward the capital where they might live in squatter camps, some going to countries that are nearby, trying to find all of them someplace safe, since the war almost overwhelmingly has killed civilians. It's not been unusual to see refugees in Sudan. But aid workers and journalists saw something that was very unusual in late 1987 and 1988. They saw a column of children, maybe 10,000 or 20,000 children, walking without their mothers or fathers across some of the most inhospitable landscape on earth. I interviewed relief workers who told me they could see the route that these children were taking by the bodies of all of the boys who had died along the way. These are kids walking without mothers or fathers, walking in a place that has very little food, very little water. This is the period I was telling you about where people had to drink their own urine to survive and eat mud to survive. But many of them died. Many, many thousands of them died of starvation, dehydration, cholera, dysentery. Some of them died of animal attacks. It's a very traumatic time. A U.S. State Department officer in Ethiopia reported back in a cable to his superiors in Washington that thousands of children were streaming across the border of Sudan into Ethiopia on the brink of starvation. He said they looked like survivors of the concentration camp. So the natural question was, where were these children coming from? Why were they walking? What led them to leave home? Well, there really are three answers to that question. When aid workers and journalists interviewed these children, they all gave a very similar answer to the question of why they had to leave their home. They said they were away from their homes tending to cattle. That's customary for boys of that age and that culture. They were away from home tending to cattle when Arab militias aligned with the northern government attacked their villages and killed their parents or kidnapped their parents and siblings. They said they had no choice but to walk into the wilderness with hopes of surviving. And they walked toward Ethiopia because they knew that in Ethiopia a rebel army from southern Sudan had some bases and ran some camps. There are two other reasons that children who came to be called the Lost Boys of Sudan walked away from their homes. I told you earlier that the government in the early 1980s in Sudan began to drift toward a more militant form of Islam. It imposed Islamic law or Sharia on the entire country, and it mandated that all schools throughout the country be taught in the Arabic language, even in portions of the country where Arabic was not the predominant language. As a practical matter, that meant for children in the South, they couldn't go to school, either because there wasn't a school nearby or because the school nearby gave instruction in Arabic and they didn't speak Arabic or didn't want to speak Arabic. So in some cases, parents actually sent their children to walk hundreds of miles to Ethiopia to get this education. A third scenario involved that rebel army in southern Sudan. I mentioned many of the children who came to be called Lost Boys were forcibly recruited to walk this hundreds of miles so that they could be trained as child soldiers and fight for this rebel army. But whatever the reason children left their homes, my goal in the book has been to make plain that nearly all of them endured a kind of trauma that we would find very, very difficult to fathom. I interviewed anthropologists who had studied this population. They say that 74% had been the victims of bombardment or shelling by artillery. Something like 92% had seen someone starve to death. 95% said someone had shot at them, and I think 97% had witnessed a killing. These were children between the ages of 6 and 12, roughly. So, the group that came to be called the Lost Boys lived for Ethiopia for 4 years. The government of Ethiopia changed hands in 1991. They had to leave. They walked back into Sudan. They endured some more horrifying experiences, including one day when they were crossing a river that divides the two countries, and several hundred of them were eaten by crocodiles or drowned or were shot by the new Ethiopian government viewed them as future recruits in this southern Sudanese rebel army that they were not friendly with. So they eventually landed in a refugee camp in Kenya, where they lived for the next 9 years. Meanwhile, the war in Sudan raged between North and South. And more people in the United States began to be aware of the depths of suffering there. It interested me greatly in researching this book and writing about Sudan for the newspaper to learn that a broad spectrum of people are interested in alleviating the crisis in Sudan and have been somewhat effective. This is a cause that brings together people who don't see eye to eye on many other political issues. You have liberal Democrats oftentimes working with conservative Republicans, civil rights activists, human rights advocates, politically conservative evangelical Christians who empathize with what they see as persecuted Christians in southern Sudan, all coming together slowly in the 1990s to call attention to this horrifying problem that was unfolding really outside of the headlines. One result of that growing political pressure was that the United States decided in 2000 and 2001 to resettle about 3,800 of these Lost Boys of Sudan. About 150 came to Atlanta. Very many of them have come here to Georgia Perimeter College. As the resettlement progressed, that's what I primarily covered for the newspaper, and that's what the book discusses. A whole lot of different things were happening to begin to put pressure on both the government of Sudan and the rebel army to end the war. One of them was the September 11th terrorist attacks here in the USA. In the early 1990s, the government of Sudan became very radicalized. It opened its doors to Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden lived in Sudan for several years in the early 1990s. It allowed many groups that the U.S. designates as terrorist organizations to come into Sudan. It landed on a U.S. list of countries that sponsor terrorism, along with Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and a few others. So, remember, after the September 11th terrorist attack, the U.S. government made a big production of saying in its new war on terror, it wouldn't distinguish between terrorists that wish the U.S. harm and countries that sponsor terrorists. This caused the leaders of Sudan to become a little bit nervous because the U.S. had just invaded Afghanistan. It caused them to respond to U.S. pressure to negotiate an end to this war. A few other things were happening. President Bush was elected in 2000. One of his key groups of supporters were politically conservative Christians. They applied pressure to him to do something about Sudan. So he actually appointed an envoy, former Senator John Danforth of Missouri, who I also interviewed for the book, 4 days before September 11th. So we had this coalescence of different factors that put a lot of pressure on Sudan to negotiate a peace deal. And the others are described at length in the book. In fact, President Carter told me that he went to Washington for the inauguration of President Bush, and they had an exchange of pleasantries on the reviewing stand where President Bush said, "Let me know if I can ever do anything for you." And President Carter said, "The only thing you can do for me is to initiate peace talks in Sudan in a fair and balanced way." So as a result of all of these different elements, both sides, North and South, that had been fighting each other for 20 years, began to negotiate very seriously. And they began to make progress toward finally ending this devastating war. The North, the government, made some big concessions. It agreed to share money from oil revenue and so forth, and allow the South to vote, to have more self-determination. Well, meanwhile, in another part of Sudan, there were people who had felt disenfranchised and left out the same way that Southerners had felt left out. They saw this negotiation yielding some fruit. They worried about getting left out. These are people who live in the western Darfur region you hear so much about. So in 2003, just as this North-South peace process was starting to really bear fruit, in the spring, the winter and spring of 2003, some rebels in Darfur attacked a government military installation. And the government responded, went overboard in its response. It armed and trained Arab militias. It really unleashed these militias. They went from village to village to village in Darfur, in villages that had tribes that supported the rebel army. And these militias have engaged in a systematic campaign of genocide. They have slaughtered innocent people. They've raped girls and branded them afterward to add to the shame. In some cases, they've raped girls and young women and then thrown them in prison for having sex outside marriage. In some places, they've chained children together and burned them alive. They'll ride into a village with rifles and machetes and just slaughter people who happen to live there, throw their bodies in wells to contaminate the water supply so that no one can live there. It has evolved into a humanitarian disaster. President Bush and the U.S. Congress has called what's happening in Darfur genocide. That's significant because the United States has signed a treaty pledging to prevent genocide. In the 1990s, President Clinton and his administration were very conscious not to use the word genocide to describe what was happening in Rwanda, even though it was obviously genocide. It became this odd word game because they worried that that would trigger a legal requirement to do something. Even though the U.S. has said it's genocide, it hasn't done nearly as much as it could. The African Union, which is a collection of about 50 governments in Africa, has sent some peacekeepers into Sudan, into Darfur. But the countries that send those troops don't have a lot of money. The U.S. and Britain and Western Europe could really pony up some money to help get the troops from place A to place B. The U.S. has allowed the International Criminal Court to begin a preliminary investigation of war criminals, which is significant because if you're the leader of Sudan and you know you face a threat of being imprisoned or hanged for being complicit in war crimes, that might prove to be an incentive to get you to back off, but that's really not proven to be an effective deterrent. So it's a mess. What's happening in Darfur is a mess. One of the questions that people always ask is, what can I do about this? It seems so far off. Seems like I'm powerless, and I can understand that. But I want to tell you in closing that there are some things that you can do. The first and most important thing you can do is educate yourself, and you're here when you could be at home taking a nap. So that's a positive thing. Many college campuses have chapters of a group called Save Darfur. It has a website called savedarfur.org. I would encourage you to visit that website, savedarfur.org. There is another website called SudanAdvocacy.com. And this is a wonderful thing because it doesn't ask for your money so much as it asks for your voice. People who run this website will occasionally send you emails urging you to write your congressman about this issue or that issue. They educate you on what the issues are. I know them. They're trustworthy. So they're good people. Remember that I told you that there are a variety of groups that have spoken up about Sudan. They actually can make a difference. They actually did make a difference in 2002. They put pressure on their Congress. Enough people put pressure on their congressmen and on the president that the Congress passed something called the Sudan Peace Act, which was instrumental in bringing peace in the North-South conflict. So there are things that you can do. I'd like to stop here and thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much.